Chapter 37. The Austrian columns came on haphazardly. Their ranks were ragged, their officers unwilling to waste time in forming them up properly. The Legion had formed a two-man-deep line across the slopes around San Cassiano. They were determined to hold on to the high ground they had fought so hard to capture. The Austrians had rallied quickly, their counterattack coming before the French could get their artillery in place. It would be down to the battered foot soldiers to hold on to what they had won. "That was fair quick," Palmer made the observation as he elbowed his way into the French line. A swift glare silenced the Legionnaire he had barged to one side. The man's loud protest shut off before it was fully formed. Palmer took his place in the front rank, directly beside Fleming, then nodded a friendly greeting. "How you faring, old son?" "I wish you would leave me alone." Now, less said, sooner mended." Palmer was checking his rifle, his hands moving over the weapon with practiced ease. "Like it or not, when this shindig is over, you and I are going to take a little walk." "I am not going anywhere." "You'll do as you're damn well told." Palmer finished with his rifle, and now checked that his bayonet was still securely locked in place. His hand came away bloody. Jack said nothing during the short exchange. He was watching the Austrian infantry as they started to swarm up the reverse side of the ridge. Their white uniforms looked splendid against the lush greenery. Even in half-broken ranks, there was something glorious in their advance. Their colours led them, the great eagles showing them the way. Men who had been running just a short time before found heart as they followed their regiment's pride back up the slope. The first order was shouted from the middle of the French line. Hundreds of rifles were pulled into shoulders, the men obeying instantly. Jack had not understood the command, but he knew an infantryman's job as well as any. The rifle Palmer had given him fitted snugly into his shoulder. He squinted down the barrel, aiming above the head of an Austrian infantryman to allow for the drop of the shot as he was firing downhill. The second order came, and Jack braced himself, curling his finger around his rifle's trigger. He held his breath, every muscle tensed. "Fire!" The sound of hundreds of rifles firing in unison roared out. Jack barely felt the kick as his rifle thumped back into his shoulder. He let it fall to the ground the moment the trigger was released. Every man did the same, the routine of reloading deeply ingrained in each of them. He snatched a fresh cartridge out of the pouch on his belly and bit off the top, spitting it to one side as he poured the powder into the barrel. He followed the powder with the bullet. With deft fingers he slipped the ramrod from its loops and used it to force the bullet to the bottom of the barrel, giving it 2 slight taps to make sure it rested on the powder. The ramrod went back into its place beneath the barrel before he slipped a fresh cap from its pouch and pressed it into place. It felt like just moments had passed since the first volley. The motions were instinctive. The rifle pulled to the shoulder for the shortest pause before the command to fire was bellowed out for a second time. "Fire!" He did not bother to select a target. He had the briefest impression of another white uniform falling away before his eyes were back on his rifle as he reloaded. The men from the Legion poured on the fire. A third volley seared out, hundreds of spinning rounds tearing into the attacking Austrians. Dozens fell, the men crumpling as the heavy Minié bullets found their marks. Jack repeated the routine again and again. His fingers hurt, and the taste of gunpowder lingered on his lips, his thirst building with every cartridge he bit open. Volley followed volley, the Legion killing and maiming as the Austrians refused to turn away. There was no time to marvel at such a brave display. Jack's world had reduced to his rifle and the men around him. His only thought was to reload as fast as he could, then send another bullet on its deadly path. He had no sense of the fight, other than his minute role in it. He was just a single part of the machine that was inflicting such terrible damage on the men in white coats. A different order was shouted. Jack stiffened, knowing what was to come. Chargez! The legions snarled into motion. Jack went with them, the battle madness coursing through him once again. It took him swiftly and completely, the need to kill overwhelming his senses, so that he roared with fury as he pounded towards his newest enemy. The battered Austrian infantry had advanced to within 50 yards. They had taken heavy casualties, but somehow they had come on, the conscripted infantrymen not knowing when they were beaten. Now they tried to make a line of their own. It was a ragged affair, and many of the men stopped in mid-evolution to stare in horror as the legionnaires were unleashed against them. Jack saw enemy muskets lifted to shoulders. He knew what was to come, but he cared nothing for the danger. The madness had him, and he screamed as he charged. The Austrians fired. It was the Legionnaire's turn to die. The Austrian muskets may have lacked the power of the French rifles, but the range was short, and the volley cut down the attackers in swathes. Jack could not hold back a cry as a musket ball seared through the soft flesh above his hip. The pain flashed brightly. Then he hit the line. An Austrian conscript lunged at him. It was a weak blow, the man's terror stealing the strength from the attack. Jack laughed as he battered it aside. He was still laughing as he hit the man with his rifle butt. It took him barely a second to ram his bayonet down before he was moving on, the Austrian soldier left clutching the terrible hole that had been torn in his belly. Within moments, the Austrian line had been splintered. Dozens died, the legionnaires ramming home their bayonets with ruthless precision. Some Austrians tried to run, but they were cut down. Jack felt no mercy as he stabbed his bayonet into the joint of a man's neck and spine. The man screamed, twisting as he fell so that he landed on his back. He lay there floundering like a recently landed fish, until Jack silenced him with an efficient thrust through the heart. His bayonet stuck fast, and he cursed as he was forced to stamp hard on the man's chest to free it. The delay nearly cost him his life. The fight had broken up into 100 vicious melees where death could come from any direction. Jack ripped his bayonet free just in time to see a white-coated soldier preparing to smash in his skull with a rifle butt. He threw himself to one side. The rifle butt caught him a glancing blow on the shoulder. Pain seared through him, but still he thrust his bayonet into the man's gut. This time he twisted the steel cruelly, freeing it before it stuck fast. The fear came then. Men were falling in droves, many cut down from the side or rear so that they died without knowing who had killed them. His nostrils flared as the familiar stink of battle caught in his throat. The sour odour of blood and shit mixed with the stench of opened guts and torn flesh. He lunged, bellowing with rage. An Austrian officer was on the point of cutting into Carney's unprotected neck. Instead of landing the blow, he turned, a scream escaping from his lips, his face revealing a horrible mix of terror and surprise as Jack drove his bayonet into his side. The Legionnaire sergeant whirled on the spot, finally alive to the danger. The Austrian was already falling away, his hands scrabbling frantically at the gaping wound. Carney's face twisted into a vicious snarl as he realized how close to death he had just come. He hammered his rifle butt down, finishing off the officer who had so nearly killed him. An Austrian conscript came at Carney from behind, crying out as he lunged. His bellow turned into a scream as Jack's bayonet took him in the throat, the long steel blade erupting from the back of his neck as Jack drove it home. "That's twice!" Jack shouted the words as he pushed forward so that he could cover Carney's back. Carney had no time to reply. Another Austrian attacked, using his bayonet in short, efficient thrusts. The sergeant battered each one away, keeping the man at bay long enough for Jack to come at him from the side. His bloodied bayonet ended the disciplined attack with a single strike to the heart. It was their last fight. The Austrians broke for a second time. A few legionnaires cheered as the enemy fled, but most just sucked down huge draughts of air before starting the hideous task of pulling the wounded from the piles of bodies that lay around them. They were not given much time to do so. The worst of the wounded would be left behind as fresh orders rallied the ranks and recalled them to their position on the ridge's crest. Whilst they had been fighting off the Austrian counterattack, the first guns had finally been manhandled into position. Now the artillerymen opened fire, their shells smashing into the fleeing troops. Fucking bastards. Jack cursed under his breath at the merciless French gunners. He sucked in a lungful of air, then started to retrace his steps back up the slope. A heavy hand on his shoulder stopped him. "I owe you my thanks." Carney's face was serious. "You'd have done the same for me." Jack had not fully caught his breath, so he gasped his reply. "Would I?" Carney's face creased into a smile. "I'm glad you think so." Jack tried to laugh, but it came out more like a sob. He took a moment to catch his breath before he replied, "I know your type. You cannot help playing the hero." Carney slapped him on the back. The fight seemed to have barely affected him at all. "Come on, Jack. That's enough of your crap. Let's get you back safe." The two men started the long trudge up the slope. Neither looked at the pile of bodies left behind, the pathetic heaps that marked the high tide line of the Austrian counterattack. Palmer and Fleming passed them by. From the look on the Legionnaire's face, he was not enjoying Palmer's presence. It appeared that Ballard's enforcer planned not to go more than a yard from Fleming's side. Jack looked at the sky. It was dark, and heavy black clouds shrouded the sun, but he guessed it could be no later than mid-afternoon. There was plenty of daylight left, plenty of time for more men to die. Chapter 38. "You're still alive, then?" Palmer greeted Jack as he made it up the last yards of the slope. Around him the exhausted legionnaires were slumping to the ground. For the moment, both the Austrians and their own officers were leaving them in peace. It was time for a moment's rest, to give thanks for being alive, and to relive the moments of the chaotic fight. "Takes more than a little scrap like that to kill me." Jack wanted nothing more than to lie on the ground. He was out of condition, a fact made all the more evident as Carney came striding past him, his breathing unaffected by the events of the last half hour. He forced as deep a breath as he could manage into his lungs, then stood straight. "Blow me, it's hot." "Not as hot as India." Palmer pulled his canteen from over his shoulder and took a long draught. Jack gave his own canteen a shake. It was still half full, so he had a drink, careful not to take too much. He knew how badly he would need it later on. Good water was as scarce as mercy on a battlefield. "Hot? This isn't hot," Carney scoffed. "In Algeria it was so hot you could feel your brain frying in your skull. During the day, at least. The nights were cold enough to freeze your balls for all time." Fleming chuckled at his sergeant's mockery. "Best be kind to them. They're just new recruits." "Hark at you. I was killing men when you were still shitting in your breeches, old son." Palmer did not care for the abuse. Fleming shrugged, then looked to Carney. "Sergeant, We should show the old man some respect." "Old man, indeed?" Palmer rose to the bait. "I didn't hear you calling me that when I killed that white-coated bastard who was about to shove his bayonet up your fucking arse." "That was kind of you." Fleming was enjoying himself. "Just as it was kind of you to leave that other fellow to me. You recall him? The one about to ram a bayonet into your balls before I killed him." The two men laughed. It earned them a few stares and some glares, the English voices clearly grating on finely stretched nerves. Carney spotted the reaction. "Enough. There'll be plenty of time for those tales. That time is not now." "No. But it is time for us to leave." Palmer's smile disappeared quicker than a routed Austrian. "Oh, son." He wrapped his hand around Fleming's elbow. "I'd be grateful if you'd walk with us." Fleming shook his arm to free it, but Palmer's great paw stayed in place. "Don't be foolish. I cannot leave now. The day is not done." "We can slip away all quiet-like. Even those French buggers will let you go for a shit. We can go and not come back. We have horses over yonder." Palmer looked at Carney. "We've all done our bit for today." Carney nodded. "I won't stop you." He glanced around at the tired men sitting on the ground. There were far fewer than there had been an hour earlier. Those left alive did not care if Fleming and the Englishman left, and the handful of officers still on their feet were too busy to notice. "There you have it." Palmer kept a firm grip on Fleming's elbow. "Now, you behave yourself and come with us." Fleming shook off Palmer's hand. "I am a Legionnaire. I will not leave my comrades." Palmer was unimpressed by such passionate loyalty. "I need you to put an end to all of this, one way or the other." Jack watched the exchange in silence, content to leave the negotiations, such as they were, to Palmer. The older man was having no more luck than he himself had had when he had tried to convince Fleming to come with them. "Hold fast." Palmer was about to grab Fleming with more force when Jack spotted a French officer riding down the line towards them. "What the devil does he want?" Palmer glared at the unwanted interruption. The officer's horse was lathered in sweat, great globules of foam at the corners of its mouth, but it still had enough energy to toss its head as the few surviving Legion officers stepped towards the man on its back. The exchange that followed was curt. The mounted officer spoke quickly and urgently, his left hand thrust out to point to the south. "Do you understand what he's saying?" Carney stood at Jack's shoulder. "No idea." Jack gave a half smile as he admitted it. "The Austrians are trying to turn our right flank." Carney spoke softly, one ear turned to listen to the conversation. "While we have been fighting up here, the men down on the plain have been under heavy attack. He says every man is needed, otherwise the day is lost." Jack twisted and looked in the direction the officer was pointing. From their place on the high ground, he could see a fair way to the south and east. The plain stretched away for miles. Most of the great expanse was wreathed in powder smoke. The men of the Legion had started their day down there, watching as their artillery had turned back the first Austrian columns. They had then moved on to assault the ridge. But it appeared that the Austrian commander had not been so quick to divert his attention from the ground that formed the French army's right flank. Through patches in the smoke, Jack could just about make out the dark blue uniforms of the French infantry. They were in line, and he could see the flashes popping out from each musket as they fired a volley at some unseen enemy. "Here we go." Carney brought his attention back to the French officer. The man had finished speaking and was in the process of wheeling his mount around. Without ceremony, he kicked hard, forcing the horse into motion. "En place!" One of the Legion's officers shouted the order to his reluctant troops. Marche ou crève! He strode down the line, urging his tired men to their feet. Carney gave Jack a tight-lipped smile. Looks like we aren't done yet. You still coming along? Jack nodded but could not return the smile. He had no choice. He would follow wherever Fleming went. Then let's go. You heard the man. We march or we die. The Legion had fought hard, but their day was not yet done. The Legion marched down the slope, keeping the pace slow and steady until they hit the flatter ground of the Great Plain. The Legionnaires were tired, but they had formed into column without a murmur. The regiment's colour led the way, the red, white and blue of the tricolour gaudy against the bruised sky. For the second time that day, Jack advanced with the French. This time he was in their ranks, rather than following behind, marching to Kearny's left, with Palmer and Fleming on his other side. It did not feel odd being in the midst of the French unit. It had been a long time since he had walked in the rank and file of an infantry column, yet he felt at home in a way that he hadn't for as long as he could remember. He might have been an Englishman hiding in the French army, but he was a soldier amongst comrades, the legionnaires around him accepting him without complaint. The pace increased as the column came down off the high ground. The officer leading the way turned them onto the road that took them along the bottom of the ridge. From somewhere just ahead, a legionnaire began to sing. The man's voice was deep, and others joined him almost immediately. They sang somberly, each word resonating through the column. It was a sound quite unlike any Jack had heard from an English regiment. The song died away, the only sound left the thump of the men's boots hitting the road's surface in unison. They marched with their heads held high, the elan of the Legion restored by the deep, melodic song. They did not keep the pace up for long. Ahead, the road was almost completely blocked. A convoy of wounded soldiers was heading towards them, the long line of wagons and ambulances stretching back for hundreds of yards. Orders were shouted and the column stopped, then filed off the road, scurrying out of the way of the miserable procession. They stood at the roadside as the convoy passed by. Every wagon and ambulance was packed full to capacity, with the less grievously wounded clinging on to any spot they could find. Dull, listless eyes stared down at the legionnaires as they passed, from faces etched with pain. Those unfortunate souls unable to secure a place in the transport plodded along at the road's edge. Many bore dreadful wounds, their proud uniforms now soaked in gore. A few sported bandages or had wounds stuffed with lint, but most were untreated, the tears and rents in their flesh left open, bloody and oozing. Some men came alone. Jack saw one marching along at a fine pace, his severed arm clutched across his chest, whilst blood pulsed freely from the stump just below the shoulder where the limb had once been. Others came in small groups, those with lesser wounds supporting those who could barely walk. All bore the same haunted expression, their assumption that it would be other men who would be hit, proven to be the false hope that it had always been. Then there were the bodies of those for whom the march had been too much. As the convoy thinned out, Jack looked along the path it had taken. Corpses were being treated without dignity. Some of those who had fallen had been dragged to one side, their broken flesh abandoned and forgotten. Others were simply left to lie where they landed, the boots of the men and the wheels of the wagons and ambulances grinding them into the dirt. Jack watched it all, holding his emotions tight. He had seen such sights before, but there was something in the numbers that came close to overwhelming him. Even the breach at Delhi had not been as bad. The last of the wounded went past, the road now empty once again. The column reformed silently. Even the officers were subdued, their orders called out just loudly enough to set the men into motion. The Legion marched once more, picking up pace now the road was clear. This time no one sang. Eventually the officer at their head turned them from the road and led them south, towards the sounds of fighting that continued unabated out on the army's right flank. They soon passed an aid post, its black flag hanging listless in the heavy air. Bodies smothered the ground in every direction. There was little way of knowing who was alive and who had died, the men lying in long lines that were being tended to by a mere handful of orderlies. Other bodies had been heaped into a single great mountain, the forms twisted and broken, the glazed eyes of the slain staring in accusation at those still clinging to life. A few local women were tending to the wounded. They offered water, the canteens they had filled taken greedily by men half crazed by thirst. There were far too few to cope with the vast swathe of humanity dumped upon them, but that did not quench their desire to help, and as the column walked past, Jack saw them working tirelessly to give some succour to as many men as they could. The column left the bitter scene behind and moved across a great field of wheat, now trampled into dust. They passed behind an isolated farm packed full of French troops. The area had clearly seen much heavy fighting already that day. The buildings that made up the farm had been nearly destroyed. The ground around them ripped and torn and covered with scorch marks from where Austrian artillery shells and rockets had fallen. Bodies lay in every direction, the dead carpeting the ground. A staff galloper rode up to the officer in command. The conversation was short, the galloper riding away almost immediately. The Legion pressed on, marching towards 3 regiments of line infantry forming up to the south of the battered farmhouse. "I know those men. They're from Bataille's brigade, part of 3rd Corps." Carney marched at Jack's side. Neither had spoken for some time, but now the American sergeant broke the spell that had fallen over them both. To their front, Jack could see a village, one that he could only assume was still held by the Austrians. "What's that place called?" He strained his eyes, but they were too far away for him to be able to see any enemy troops. "Hell, I don't know." Carney peered ahead. "These damn places all look the same to me." "Well, whatever it's called, it's about to be attacked." Jack saw French cavalry moving up to cover the flanks of the infantry. At least 6 battalions were on the move, their bright tricolours creating a splendid sight. The officer leading the Legion turned to shout at his men. They picked up the pace immediately, heading towards the French infantry beyond the farmhouse. They had arrived in time to join the attack. Chapter 39. Ballard held the wounded hussar down, pinning him by the shoulders. The man fought against him, and it took all of Ballard's strength to keep his back pressing against the tabletop. The surgeon who worked at his side swore under his breath and spat out a wad of phlegm. Neither altered the pace of the saw that was moving back and forth at a steady, even pace. The noise as it cut through the bone set Ballard's nerve on edge. It grated in his ears and echoed in his skull. He had already listened to it 100 times, yet familiarity had not dulled its horror. The surgeon gave a short gasp. It was followed immediately by the solid thump of the severed leg hitting the ground. Ballard felt the hussar give a great shudder, his body twisting with one last lurch before going still. "Merde." The surgeon leaned forward and peered into the hussar's face, a bloodied finger poking at the man's eyes. There was no reaction to the clumsy touch, so he bellowed for his orderlies to come and collect the fresh corpse. Ballard stood back as the two overworked assistants dragged the hussar away. There was no time to reflect on the man's passing. Another pair of orderlies bustled over. A white-coated Austrian soldier held awkwardly between them. No distinction was made between the soldiers of the two armies. Here, in the hell of the field hospital, they were just men. The foreign soldier was shrieking as they carried him, his arms and legs jerking uncontrollably. The moment he was laid on the table, he jackknifed, his hands clawing at Ballard as he tried to escape the surgeon's knife. He was pushed down cruelly. There would be no escape. One of the two orderlies stayed to help Ballard hold the patient down. Both of the Austrian's legs had been crushed below the knee. There was little left except for a pulsating mass of flesh and bone that had twisted and fused together, so that what remained barely looked human. Ballard could only suppose that the man had been run over by an artillery limber or the wheel of a cannon. He had seen a similar wound in the Strand when a young boy had been run down by a hackney carriage. That boy had died, and he held out little hope for the Austrian soldier. The surgeon snapped a command, and Ballard pressed down with his whole body weight onto the man's chest. His arms were shaking with the effort, but somehow he managed to pin the Austrian in place long enough for the surgeon to take off first one leg and then the other. The second severed limb hit the ground, and an orderly returned to help haul the Austrian away. The man still fought against them, his cries unaltered throughout the whole dreadful process. To Ballard's surprise, he had survived the double amputation, whereas the French hussar had died when having just a single limb removed. He wondered why that would be, what force there was hidden in the Austrian's physical form that was lacking in the hussar's. He stood back and wiped his sleeve across his face. It was sweltering in the farm outbuilding that had been requisitioned as a hospital, and the sweat was running freely down his face. His blue uniform was streaked with ordure, the sleeves bloodied and the golden lace on its front half hidden under a sheet of gore. He'd never felt so dirty. It was as if the blood and the filth were somehow seeping inside him, polluting his soul for all time. The orderlies were slow with the next wounded man. It gave Ballard an opportunity to look for Mary. He saw her almost immediately. She was crouched next to a wounded French soldier, carefully spooning water into his mouth. The man clutched at her arm as he sucked on the wooden ladle, holding on so tightly that she had to force his fingers loose before she could shuffle over to the man lying next to him. There were so many wounded. The ambulances, limbers and carts arrived non-stop, each packed full. Still more men staggered in, those able to walk drawn to the aid station by the sight of its black flag. The buildings had been filled in the first hour. Now the wounded lay in long lines outside. There was no shade or respite from the heat. Their only comfort came from a handful of local women who were offering what aid they could. The wounded were desperate for water, and many of the volunteers were pressed into service, hauling bucket after bucket from a stream a few hundred yards away, so that at least some of them could have a mouthful or two. Mary felt his gaze and turned to look at him. From somewhere she summoned a tight-lipped smile, the gesture fleeting, but one he appreciated greatly. He hoped he was winning her approval, that his efforts as surgeon's mate were improving her opinion of him. His reverie was brought to an end as the next body was thumped onto the table. He pressed down, not caring that his hands slipped across a man's chest sheeted in blood. The rasping sound of the bone saw at work came almost immediately. Billy hid behind the tree. He did not know how long he had been there. He had moved to screen himself from view when the first men had come past. It had seemed a wise thing to do, even though he could not do the same for the horses, which were still tethered where Palmer had left them. He had mastered his fear. Cannon fire still thundered out, the noise ever present, but he could not maintain his terror forever. Somehow it had dulled, the unceasing pounding fading into the background, so that now he barely even heard it, even when it intensified so that the individual blasts blurred into one great roar. Safe in his hiding place, he had watched the first wounded stagger past. 2 men had walked together, their arms intertwined. He had heard them laughing, their loud voices reaching him as he cowered away. Since then he had seen a steady stream of men descending from the high ground. Most came in 1s or 2s. All had been wounded. It was not hard to see where they had been hit. Some were dragged, their legs shattered or even missing completely. Others staggered along by themselves, pressing their hands into open wounds or cradling an arm or shoulder shattered by an enemy bullet. Some had not made it past his vantage point. He had counted at least a dozen who had either collapsed or been left by their comrades, their attempt to reach help ending in death. The bodies lay where they had fallen, untended and ignored. A fresh wave of men came past. He peered at them, trying to see their injuries. He frowned. These were the first he had seen who appeared whole, their uniforms unblemished. They were moving faster too, pressing forward urgently. He did not recognize their uniform, but he could see that it was not the same one that Jack and Palmer had donned before they had left him. He shrank deeper into his cover. He did not know whether these men were French or Austrian. The idea that they could be the enemy both frightened and excited him. He slipped his hand into the waistband of his trousers and pulled out the revolver. He knew how to use it. Jack had taught him on the journey. He remembered Jack's hand ruffling his hair as he declared him to be a fine shot, the memory making him smile. The weapon was heavy in his hand. It felt solid, powerful, reassuring. He squinted at the men running past. He imagined them rushing towards him as they spotted the horses. In his mind's eye, he pictured himself standing, the revolver in his hand. He saw their faces twist in fear before he gunned them down, one after another, not a single bullet missing. A shout shattered his imaginings. It came again, louder this time, the voice horribly close. He shrank away, his childish notion of fighting swamped by a sudden rush of fear. Heart pounding, he peered around the tree. 4 men were running directly towards him. The shouting came louder then. He knew it was directed at him, that the men had spied the horses and were coming to take them for their own. He rose up on his haunches, the instinct to run taking over before the thought had fully formed. Yet he held himself back, refusing to obey the urgings. Jack would not run. He stood even though his legs were shaking so hard they were barely able to support him. The 4 men saw him immediately. They shouted at him. He understood nothing, but he heard the anger in their voices, and he heard their fear. "Go away!" The command emerged with little force. "Go away!" The men were coming on fast. They showed no sign of heeding him. "Go away, or I'll shoot!" He lifted the revolver, holding it in both hands. He swallowed to clear the knot that had tied itself in his throat. His fear was surging through him. He felt weak and his backside puckered and quivered. Yet he stood his ground, holding the revolver as steady as he could. There was no more shouting. The men were thrashing through the undergrowth at the edge of the copse. They were close now, no more than 20 or 30 yards away. A face appeared over the end of the barrel. Billy saw reddened cheeks above a thick black moustache and brown eyes that blazed in anger. It was the face of the first man he would have to kill. The man was saying something. The words spewed forth. He came closer, moving fast. Billy's finger tightened on the trigger. He felt sick. Fear choked him. The moment to fire had come and passed. The man was upon him in an instant. The gun was snatched from his grasp. He had time to cry out before a fist slammed into his face. He fell hard, blood pouring from his nose. He cried then, the fear and the pain mixing inside him. He was still crying when the boot caught him in the pit of his stomach. The blows came fast. The man he had come so close to shooting attacked relentlessly, kicking and punching without pause. Billy screamed. He could not hold it back. He screamed again, even as his mouth filled with the blood that streamed across his face. The noise goaded his attacker, and he lashed out with his heavy boot, catching the boy in the side of the head. The screaming stopped as the blackness took Billy away. Chapter 40. The French did not linger. With the Legion reinforcing their battered ranks, the men of Bataille's brigade went on the attack. The Legion had regrouped into a mixed formation, with 4 companies forming a 2-man deep line supported by 2 companies on either flank, arranged in column. All the battalions in the attack were arranged in a similar fashion, and they advanced en échiquier, spaced as though each was on a separate square of a chessboard. Hundreds of men in tightly packed ranks were committed to the assault on the Austrian infantry divisions that had come so close to folding the French army's right flank. The Legion marched through clouds of dust. It blinded the troops, the wind whipping it across their faces so that they were forced to advance with their eyes screwed almost shut. It scoured their faces dry, leaving them red and sore. "We still need to keep an eye on this one, Jack." Palmer protected his mouth with his hand as he called across from where he was walking on the far side of Fleming, their company marching in line in the heart of the Legion's formation on the left of the advance. "Remember our mission. We keep this fellow safe, come what may." "I'm right here, you know." Fleming laughed. Palmer spoke as if he were incapable of understanding the conversation. "I know, old son, and I intend to keep it that way." Palmer marched easily, even as the Legion picked up the pace. Jack had no time to listen to Palmer. He was watching the large body of French cavalry that was rushing to form up on the infantry's left flank. He saw 3 different uniforms in the mix as the cavalry manoeuvred into 2 long lines. 2 regiments formed the first line, with the second consisting of just 1. He was pleased to see the French horsemen. Now that they were on the wide expanse of the plain, their flanks were vulnerable. If the Austrians got the chance, they would send their own cavalry to attack the advancing French infantry, who would then be forced to form square, the only defence they had against rampaging horsemen. The formation would keep the cavalry at bay, but it would leave the infantry in tightly packed ranks, unable to either advance or retreat. They would then be at the mercy of the Austrian artillery. The enemy round-shot would be sure to massacre them where they stood. The walls of bayonets would be ripped apart. Then the cavalry could ride them down unopposed, any man left standing certain to be butchered by the merciless Austrian riders. The French cavalry would protect them from such a fate, their role vital if the assault was to result in victory. The cavalry did not take long to form up, and Jack kept watching them as they began to advance, their ranks ordered and steady. "There they go." Fleming was watching too. He flashed a smile in Jack's direction. Jack kept his eyes on the horsemen. The 3 regiments were picking up the pace and were already advancing faster than the men they were there to protect. Where the hell do they think they're going? He did not understand the cavalry commander's decision. They should be guarding our bloody flank. Fleming gave a very Gallic shrug. They do as they please. Jack shook his head as the cavalry started to canter. It was folly. He looked to their front. He was taller than most of the Legionnaires. At that moment, all he could see of the Austrians was a skirmish line, a thin, dispersed chain of light troops whose job it was to screen the main line from any scouts the French sent forward. The French cavalry had seen the same, and now pressed forward to ride the light troops down. "Fucking plungers!" Palmer spat out as he saw the same as Jack. "They should stay on our flank." Jack could only agree. The French cavalry were already moving fast, the noise of hundreds of hooves drumming into the ground, washing over the slower-moving infantry. What a damn waste! There was time for him to give his own verdict, before the French cavalry swept into the line of enemy skirmishers. It was not a fight. The French riders in the first line attacked stirrup to stirrup. They rode over the thin screen of skirmishers like a wave washing onto a beach. The Austrian light troops simply disappeared, with not one French rider unhorsed. Buoyed by their success, the French cavalry pressed on. Bugles blaring, they inclined to the left, then galloped on, now heading for the main enemy line. Their horses were at full speed, and they hurtled over the ground, their riders cheering, swords raised high. The enemy infantry had witnessed the destruction of their skirmish line. They were no fools. They knew the fate of infantry caught in line by cavalry. "They'll form square." Jack was watching the fight even as the Legion marched forward. He knew what was about to happen. A tight knot had tied itself deep in his gut as he bore witness to what he was certain would be the destruction of the French cavalry. It was now a race, one where the loser would die. Already the French cavalry were closing in on the enemy line. Their horses were slowing, the long gallop sapping their strength, but the momentum of the charge was with them, and they powered towards the closest Austrian regiment. The men in white coats knew what they had to do. The line was already breaking up, the infantry rushing into the formation that would save them from the rampaging cavalry. Once the four walls of the square were formed, they would be safe. Each wall would be at least 4 ranks deep. Those in the front rank would squat down, the butts of their muskets ground into the earth so that the bayonets pointed up, ready to disembowel any enemy horse that should come close. The men standing in the ranks behind would thrust out their own bayonets, forming an impenetrable wall of steel that no cavalryman, no matter how brave or foolish, could hope to cut their way through. With their attack thwarted, the cavalry would be easy targets for the infantry's muskets. They would be shot down as they milled around outside the square, their attack over the minute the infantrymen closed the last gap in the formation. The Austrian infantry knew it as well as he did. Already the first battalions were nearly fully reformed. Jack could almost hear the howls of frustration coming from the French cavalrymen, their charge about to end in either death or the ignominy of a long gallop to the rear. But one Austrian battalion was too slow. Jack spotted them first. They were just to the left of the French cavalry's line of attack. He could see no reason for their tardiness. Perhaps they were new recruits, not yet adept at the manoeuvre. Perhaps their officers had delayed, the order coming too late to give their men enough time to get into the new formation. Whatever the reason, they were now doomed. The French cavalry swerved to the left. Their pace seemed to increase as they saw a target for their charge. Their bugles blared, the sound urgent and demanding, and the line of riders hurtled towards the half-formed square, their horses spurred hard for every last vestige of speed. The poor bastards. Jack could not hold back the verdict. The stupid bastards. It was Carney who had the last word. The cavalry hit the enemy hard, driving deep into the half-formed ranks. It was bravely done. Some of the horsemen were unseated, the enemy fighting on even in the face of death, but most rode the white-coated infantrymen down, hacking at any man standing. Many Austrian soldiers tried to flee, their attempt to turn the massacre into sport, and the French cavalrymen competed to ride the runners down. The destruction of the enemy battalion was hard to watch. No foot soldier could look on easily as the men on horses butchered others who fought on their own 2 feet. Not one man in the Legion cheered as their comrades in the cavalry won their victory. Within minutes, the fight was over. Hundreds of Austrian soldiers lay dead or dying, the ground smothered with bodies. The French cavalry were in disarray, the ordered ranks of the charge long since broken. Their horses were blown, their strength spent. It was time to retreat, to reform the ranks and return to the flanks of the infantry columns. But the Frenchmen wanted more. "Come back!" Jack was the first to shout. The cry was picked up as men throughout the Legion beckoned to the cavalry. It was to prove a futile gesture. As the French horsemen milled around the bodies of the men they had slain, the bugle called, summoning them back to the charge. The riders responded, surging away from the remains of the slaughtered battalion. They rode in a mob, any last vestiges of cohesion lost, cheering as they charged for a 3rd time. They brandished swords that were bloody to the hilt and kicked hard with their spurs, forcing their mounts on as they sought another victory, another target for their insatiable desire for glory. The closest Austrian battalions waited in fully formed squares. They had stood by, powerless to intervene, as their comrades were butchered. Now they were being given a chance for revenge. The French cavalry advanced gamely. Their horses laboured along, lathered in sweat and covered in blood. Yet still they managed to pick up the pace, the wild joy of the charge driving them on. The Austrians watched them come. Their ranks stood firm, the wall of bayonets presented, the men ready to fire. The Legion was still marching towards the enemy line. They were too far away to be anything other than spectators. Their ranks were silent as they watched the cavalry ride to their doom, every legionnaire certain of what was to come. The first Austrian square opened fire. First one wall, then another fired a volley. At close range, even the outmoded muskets were brutally effective. Each volley cut down swathes of riders. The cavalrymen rode on. They were committed to the charge now. Their momentum drove them past the first square and into the face of the next. Another volley roared out, cutting down the leading riders before they were even close to the wall of bayonets. The pace of the charge was slowing. Some horses fell as they stumbled over the bodies of the slain. Others balked as their riders rode them at the squares, the animals refusing to obey no matter how hard they were spurred. The Austrian soldiers stood firm. Volley after volley seared into the broken ranks, killing men and horses alike. The French cavalry had won a great victory, yet now they died in droves. Those left standing tried to escape the vicious close-range fire that was decimating their numbers. At last, the cavalry turned for the rear. The survivors of the charge streaked away from the slaughter, riding hard. The Austrians cheered as the French broke. The sound rippled from one square to the next, reaching the men in the French columns as they marched to fight on the same ground. The cheers continued even as the squares broke up. The Austrian infantry quick to return to the formation they had started in. The long 3-man deep line reappeared almost as if nothing had happened, the lost battalion forgotten as the ones on either side closed the gap in the line. The French cavalry had tried to win the battle by themselves. Many of their number had died for such foolishness. Now it was down to the infantry. The men marching to the beat of the drums did not hope for glory, nor did they seek to write their names in the history books. They marched to fight. Chapter 41. The infantry pressed on. the drums driving them forward. Their officers understood the need for speed now that the foolishness of the cavalry had left their flanks exposed. Without their protection, the infantry had to press home the attack before the Austrian commanders saw an opportunity to send forward their own mounted troops. Deep in the heart of the Legion, Jack felt the pulsating rhythm of the drums resonate in his soul. The men around him advanced with relentless purpose, the young drummers beating out the staccato rhythm of the march without pause. They were approaching the small village that Kearny had been unable to name. Ahead, the Austrian line was interspersed with lines of cannon standing wheel to wheel. Now these guns opened fire, the large French formations offering a fine target. Jack heard the roar of the first massed volley. He stared at the sky, picking out the pencil-thin lines that raced towards the Legion at breakneck speed. God keep us. There was time for the muttered prayer before the fast-moving round-shot hit. The iron balls tore into the ranks, ripping through bodies before slamming into the ground with ferocious violence and skipping back into the air, the collision with the earth doing nothing to stall their progress. The screaming began. Every round shot had found a mark. Men were flung to the ground, their bodies torn by the solid shot. Huge gaps were gouged in the line, dozens falling to just the first volley. The Legion's sergeants bellowed the orders that closed the ranks, the litany of battle that would continue unabated as the infantrymen walked into the face of the enemy fire. The dead and wounded were left behind, their fellows deaf to their cries. The second volley seared out across the plain. Jack could not help but flinch as the round shot ripped into the Legion. Somehow it kept grinding its way forward. Another volley tore through them, followed by another. Jack saw men die just feet away from where he walked. A round shot hit a sergeant 5 files to his right. The man's head disappeared in a shower of blood and bone. The body tottered on, marching in time by itself for at least 5 or 6 paces before it fell, the Legionnaire in the rank behind using his rifle to lever it to one side. Jack focused his gaze on the back of the man in front. His body was on fire, and every nerve screamed at him to run from the merciless bombardment. Somehow, he controlled his mind, forcing himself to keep placing one foot after the other. He stayed close to Fleming as the ranks closed to fill the gaps torn in the line. Everything was happening in a rush now. They were still moving forward, but every other step seemed to be to the left as more and more gaps opened up. "Hungarians!" Fleming bellowed the word at him. "What?" Jack didn't understand. "Those bastards are Hungarian!" Fleming fired back the answer. Jack stared at the men to his front. He did not know if Fleming was right, but he could see that although they sported the same white coats as the other enemy troops he had seen, their trousers were tighter than those worn by the men he had fought on the slopes near San Cassiano. The Hungarians were a part of the great Austrian Empire, and its soldiers had a reputation as vicious, merciless fighters who took no prisoners. As he stared, the Hungarian line seemed to take a quarter turn to the right and raised their muskets. He was close enough to hear the enemy officers shouting their orders, the foreign words coming clearly enough even over the bellows of the French commanders. With a great roar, the Hungarians opened fire. Jack held back the cry that sprang to his lips. The air around him was filled with a violent storm, as if 1,000 snapping, biting insects had been released. Men to his left and right screamed as they were hit. Some fell, others reeled away, the force of the impact knocking them backwards. The Legion was ordered to halt. Jack glanced to his left. Palmer and Fleming were still with him, as was Kearny. The Legionnaire sergeant was hauling more men into position, plugging the gaps as the Legion prepared to return fire. "Ajustez la visée!" Jack could not see the men who gave the order to prepare a fire, but the Legionnaires around him raised their weapons and it was easy to copy them. He pulled his rifle snugly into his shoulder. There was time to squint down the barrel, to line up a Hungarian face above the sights. "Feu!" Every man in the line fired instantly. Jack saw the white-coated ranks showered in a red mist. Dozens fell, the neatly formed ranks gutted by the Legionnaire's close-range volley. Then he looked down, the rifle already falling from his shoulder, his hand reaching for a fresh cartridge. The Hungarians fired again before he could get more than halfway through reloading. The power of the enemy volley was as nothing when compared to their first. Still, dozens of Frenchmen were hit, their screams adding to the chaos. He paid them no heed, the air around him wonderfully still, and worked to reload with as much speed as he could muster. Then the Hungarian cannon opened fire once again. If their infantry's first volley was dreadful, the cannon fire was hell unleashed. With the range closed, the gunner had switched to canister shells, metal cases packed full of musket balls that turned the cannons into glorified shotguns. The volleys scythed through the French ranks, killing and maiming with wanton destruction. Men were torn apart, their lives ripped out of their bodies in an act of impossible violence. It was as if the line simply ceased to be. Groups of men were left standing, but in between great swathes of empty space showed where each canister shell had been aimed. The Legionnaires paused in their reloading and stared at one another. The shock of such destruction reflected in every expression. Veteran soldiers who had fought a dozen battles wept as they saw their precious regiment wiped out around them, the scale of the slaughter beyond comprehension. Jack glanced at Fleming, checking that he was unharmed. The Englishman stared back, eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream of horror. The Legion stubbornly stood fast. Those men still alive pushed away the horror, then raised their rifles and fired at the enemy. More men in white coats fell, the heavy French bullets cutting them down all along the line. The Legionnaires cheered then, goading the Austrians, throwing insults after their bullets. It was a fine display of courage, the battered, bleeding ranks roaring in defiance. The cheering intensified, men baying with anger and fear, the sound taking on an unearthly tone. Then the enemy guns fired a second volley of canister. Jack flinched. The clumps of French infantry were gutted, the last of their cohesion shattered. Many died, their bodies falling alongside those already shot down, the firing line now composed more of corpses than of living men. With a great cheer, the Hungarians charged. Jack saw the enemy's faces as they were unleashed to the attack, twisted, sneering, teeth bared and lips pulled back. They ran hard, bayonets thrusting forward, their officers' swords pointing at the remains of the French line. The air was filled with their battle cry, a dreadful banshee wail that grew with volume as they charged. The last Legionnaires stood firm. There was no order to retreat, no thought of running. The men of the Legion would stand and fight. Chapter 42. Chargez! The command came when the Hungarians were no more than 20 yards away. Jack did not know who gave the order. As one, the remains of the Legion threw themselves forward. They did not care that the Hungarian line contained at least twice as many men as their own. They did not care that their flanks were exposed. They cared only for violence, for revenge. Jack bellowed as he ran forward. He released his fear and let the fury of battle fill his head. Nothing mattered, not Fleming, not Ballard, not even his own life. He just wanted to kill. The two sides closed in a rush. Jack picked his target, his eyes flickering from the Hungarian's bayonet to his face. There was time to look into the other man's eyes and see fear. His first victim was young, little more than a boy, his pale cheeks darkened with a thin pelt of hair, and his expression revealing his terror at finding himself in the front rank. The boy's mouth opened as the two lines collided. It was still open when Jack battered his opponent's musket to one side and thrust his bayonet into his throat. He felt nothing as he killed. It was too easy. The boy no match for the brutal skills he had honed on the battlefield. The Hungarian fell, hands clasped to the ruin of his throat, the blood already gushing from his mouth. Jack ignored him and drove forward, ramming his bloodied bayonet at a man in the second rank. Carney fought at his side, the Legionnaire sergeant killing with ruthless efficiency. Jack's next blow was parried, his bayonet pushed wide. The second man he fought roared in triumph as he deflected the 17-inch blade. The roar was shut off as Jack slammed his rifle butt forward, using his momentum to deliver the blow with enough force to smash his target to the ground. "Come on!" Jack screamed his wild challenge. He pulled his rifle back, then thrust it forward, driving his bayonet into a man's stomach. Then he turned to batter his elbow into Hungarian's throat, following the blow with the end of his rifle's butt, which he drove into the man's face. The fight was descending into chaos. Jack grunted as someone hammered his shoulder with a musket barrel. He turned, flailing his rifle around, only to find the man who had struck him already dying with Carney's bayonet in his heart. A Hungarian thrust his bayonet at Jack's side. The blade slipped past his hip, the steel barely an inch from his flesh. He counterattacked, roaring in triumph as he punched his own blade through the man's open mouth. The Hungarian dropped his musket, his hands clasping to the dreadful wound. Jack cut him down without mercy, driving his bayonet into his chest, then kicking the body away to free the blade. He was given no time to aim another blow. A Hungarian came at him from the left, bayonet thrust at his chest. He twisted away, letting the bayonet slide past, only to nearly impale himself on another that came at him from the other side. The melee was swirling all around him now. The outnumbered legionnaires were fighting hard, but they were being cut down in droves. Jack could only defend, parrying blade after blade. Carney fought at his side, the two men fighting to stay alive. The Legion sergeant staggered as a rifle butt caught him on the thigh. He blundered into Jack, pushing him forward. A bayonet came for him. It sliced through his upper arm, the sharp steel cutting through his uniform jacket with ease. He jerked away, ducking under a swinging musket, but losing his balance in the process. He fell, landing awkwardly on his right side, his rifle trapped beneath his body. A wild-eyed Hungarian punched his bayonet down, seeking to kill him as he scrabbled on the ground. Before the blow could land, Jack kicked out and caught the man's knee. It was a cruel blow, and the man shrieked as his limb buckled. He tumbled forward, and Jack reached up, grabbing him by the throat, pulling him downwards. The Hungarian sprawled on top of him. Jack kept his fingers locked around the man's throat, even as his cheek pressed against his foe's face, desperate gasps for breath filling his mouth. He rolled his enemy over, fingers still digging into the soft flesh under the man's chin. As soon as his weight was on top, he lifted the Hungarian towards him, then smashed him violently back into the ground, all the while throttling him with every ounce of strength he possessed. The Hungarian died quickly, his eyes staring up in accusation even as his last breath left his body. Another rifle slammed into Jack's back, throwing him forward over his victim's body. As he rolled onto his side, There was time to see the man who had struck him preparing to lunge down, to see the bloodied bayonet that was about to kill him. The blow never came. The tip of another bayonet erupted from the man's neck, the enemy soldier killed before he could plunge his own blade into Jack's gut. "Get up, you fool!" Carney bellowed. Jack did not need to be told twice. He grabbed his fallen rifle and lumbered to his feet. The moment he found his balance, he killed a Hungarian soldier, striking him down just before the man thrust at Carney from behind. He looked for other legionnaires. The fighting blocked much of his view, but he could see their ranks were dreadfully depleted. Even as he tallied their numbers, the first broke and ran. It was the final confirmation he needed. "Run!" he bellowed into Carney's ear. He did not wait to see if the command was heard. Instead, he grabbed the Legionnaire sergeant's arm and pulled him backwards. A Hungarian howled in frustration as Jack hauled Carney out of his reach. The howl turned into a shriek of horror as Jack drove his bayonet into the man's groin. "Go, go!" Jack ripped his blade out of his victim's flesh and smashed the rifle's butt into another Hungarian's bayonet, knocking it to one side. Then he was running, legs pounding into the ground, heart hammering in his chest. Carney came with him. The two men ran hard. Other legionnaires followed, the remnants of the legion finally giving way to the enemy's superior numbers. They fled the melee, many dying as the frustrated Hungarians cut them down the moment they turned their backs. Jack tried to look around him as he ran, searching the chaos for a sight of either Palmer or Fleming. He saw neither. The other French battalions were retreating, mostly in good order, their ranks still formed. The Hungarians who had beaten the Legion did not give chase. The fight had been short and sharp, and those who had survived had no appetite to run after the broken French regiment. Jack saw the enemy soldiers checking the bodies on the ground. Any wounded legionnaire they discovered was greeted with a cheer before a bayonet was rammed down, the Frenchman dispatched without a qualm. Jack stumbled, his tired legs weak. "Run!" Carney grabbed his shoulder, pulling him on. The instruction came in between gasps for breath. Jack did not look back again. "Where the hell are they?" He found the breath to shout the question at Carney, even as they ran. He was roundly ignored. Carney was pulling away, Jack was struggling. The humid air rasped in his throat. His chest felt as if an iron band had been pulled tight across his ribcage. It took all his willpower to stay on his feet. To his relief, Carney slowed. As he eased up, his legs almost gave way. "Crap!" The sergeant twisted as he spat out the single word. He grabbed at Jack, taking tight hold of his shoulder. Jack's relief at the slower pace did not last. His breath echoed in his ears, and his heart thumped as if it was about to burst. But still he heard the ominous drumming on the ground that he recognized in an instant. Fuck. He turned and looked over his shoulder. The Austrian cavalry were thundering past their Hungarian allies. Hundreds of riders had been unleashed to the slaughter, the broken ranks of the Legion the kind of target every cavalryman dreamt of. In open ground, the legionnaires would not stand a chance. "This way!" Carney pulled at him. "Come on!" Jack needed no urging. The pair ran, changing direction. He trusted Carney, sensing that the sergeant had spotted something that might offer them a chance of survival. He hoped he was right. He had not seen any cover of any sort. On the plain, the scattered infantry would be easy pickings for the rampaging Austrian cavalry. Around them, the legionnaires fled in every direction, each man making his own bid for survival. He saw some banding together, a rough and ready square drawing in some of the survivors. But it was too far away for him to consider running to join it. He tried and failed to see if Palmer or Fleming had made it to the group's relative safety. All he saw was the Austrian cavalry increasing their speed, the riders gouging back their spurs as they urged their horses into the charge. It was time to forget any notion of looking for the two men. They would have to fend for themselves. The sound of the Austrian horses was getting louder. Jack heard the first screams as the slowest legionnaires on the far left flank of the attack were cut down without mercy. Carney had kept hold of his arm. They ran together, both blowing hard. The screams got closer. Legionnaires who had run at their side were being slain, their wrong choice of direction costing them their lives. Jack searched the ground ahead, trying to spot something that would give them shelter. He saw nothing but open ground, a great field of trampled rye stretching away in every direction. Cheers came from behind them. Austrian voices bellowed as they killed. The cheers turned to hoots of glee as some spotted the pair of blue-coated legionnaires still trying to escape. "Where the hell are we going?" Jack choked on the words. He clasped at the arm that was grasping his own. He felt Carney falter, his strength fading. Hooves drummed on the ground. He could not look back to see who would be the one to kill him. The noise was relentless, the drumming coming at pace. It was all he could hear, his ears filled with the sound of oncoming death. "There!" Carney gasped out the single word. His gait had become uneven, and Jack had to pull hard to keep him moving. Again he searched the ground ahead. Finally he spotted what Carney had found. A drainage ditch had been dug along one edge of the field. It was not deep, perhaps just 3 or 4 feet, but it was all they had. "Come on, then!" He hauled on Carney's arm. The man was heavy and was slowing fast. Together they stumbled on, neither able to look back at the Austrian cavalrymen spurring after them. "Get down!" Jack roared the order, then dived forward. They fell together, hitting the ground hard. Momentum tumbled them into the ditch, their bodies tangled together. Jack felt the air rush from his straining lungs. Then Carney's elbow caught him just above the ear, knocking him half senseless. The fall saved them. He had pulled them down moments before the Austrian cavalrymen would have reached them. Instead of cutting at the two fugitives, the pair of riders had to force their horses to jump the ditch. Even as Jack and Carney were still rolling to its bottom, the horses' hooves were passing by just a matter of feet above their heads. Chapter 43. Palmer punched his bayonet into a white-coated soldier's chest, twisting the steel hard lest it be trapped in his victim's flesh. Another man, an officer, came at him almost instantly, sword lunging towards his head. He parried the blow, ignoring the splinter of wood cut from the rifle's barrel that drew blood as it seared across his cheek. The Austrian officer died a moment later, with Palmer's bayonet in his heart, his shriek of horror lost in the bellows and grunts of men fighting for their lives. Fleming still fought at his side. He had lost his kepi, and his face was streaked with blood from where a bayonet had cut through the soft flesh of his cheek. Palmer did all he could to protect the younger man, but in the swirling hand-to-hand combat he could only do so much, and Fleming was fighting hard just to stay alive. Palmer parried another attack, then another. He wanted to spit, the stench of blood and shit sticking in his throat. All he could do was batter away the bayonets that came at them, the enemy swarming around the handful of legionnaires that still stood. The first men began to run. He saw them go, the remains of the line breaking up fast. He turned, swatting aside another steel blade aimed at his guts, and looked for his comrades. He saw Jack almost immediately. His fellow impostor was fighting hard, but the Hungarians were pressing all around him. Even as he watched, Jack went down, his body swallowed up by the sea of white uniforms. Palmer had seen enough. He turned his attention back to the melee, snarling with anger as a bayonet reached for his throat. He ducked, letting the weapon come past, before stamping forward and driving his own blade into his attacker's heart. Another Hungarian came at him, his bayonet held low. Palmer gave him no time to use it. He sidestepped the inevitable thrust, smashing the man to the ground with his rifle's butt. The man fell, yet dozens more immediately pressed forward, the tide of white-coated soldiers relentless and seemingly without end. He thrust his bayonet forward repeatedly, keeping the enemy at bay a moment longer. The Hungarians nearest to him backed away, giving him time to turn once more. "Come on, old son!" Palmer had fought in enough battles to know when one was lost. He reached forward to grab Fleming by the collar, hauling him away. Fleming needed little urging. He was facing two Hungarian bayonets, both already bloodied to the hilt. They came for him as Palmer pulled him backwards, thwarted as their target was dragged away. The two men turned and ran. They paid no attention to the howls of frustration as they escaped. Instead, they put their heads down and pumped their arms, finding the strength to sprint away. They ran with a few dozen other legionnaires, survivors of the bitter fight, clinging together. Together they pounded back over the ground they had advanced across, their path taking them past the bodies of the men struck down by the enemy cannon fire. "Horses!" Fleming heard the Austrian cavalry first and shouted the warning. Palmer glanced over his shoulder. He saw the threat as the Austrian cavalry came cantering around the side of the Hungarian line and slowed his pace, head twisting from side to side as he assessed their options. He saw no place to hide. "On me!" He bellowed the order, not knowing if anyone would understand, let alone obey. He grabbed at Fleming, forcing the younger man to his side. "Tell them!" For a moment, Fleming stared at him. Then he started shouting in loud, rapid French, summoning the running legionnaires to join them. The retreating French soldiers understood. These were no raw recruits. Most had fought before, and they knew there was only one way to survive against marauding enemy cavalry. Dozens of battered legionnaires formed around Palmer. This was no organised square, just a huddle of tired, bloodied men who did not know when they had lost. "Ici!" Fleming bellowed the order, summoning more men from the rout. Some heeded him, changing course to join the group who stood in a rough circle, bayonets held outwards. Others simply ran on, unwilling to stay on the field of battle a moment longer. Palmer concentrated on loading his rifle. Others followed his lead, the men skinning their knuckles on their bloodied bayonets. He lifted the weapon the moment it was loaded. The Austrian cavalry were close now. Their swords rose and fell, the slowest legionnaires cut down as they tried to evade the men on horseback. "Here they come!" he sang out in warning. Men still halfway through reloading stopped and presented their bayonets, holding them out to force the enemy riders away. Just over 50 men stood with Fleming and Palmer. Their square bore little comparison to the well-formed ones that had defeated the French cavalry, but it would have to do. Palmer squinted down his barrel, aiming at one of the leading Austrian cavalrymen. He held himself still, then pulled the trigger. His target's head snapped backwards, the rifle bullet finding its mark in the centre of his face. "Got the bucker!" Palmer hissed as he saw the horseman fall. There was no time for him to say anything else. The first Austrians pressed close. A handful of other legionnaires fired, emptying some of the saddles nearest to the square. It was enough to remind the Austrians that not every man was an easy target. Many of the cavalrymen swerved away, their horses shying as the ragged square opened fire, but not all. One officer rode close before hauling hard on the reins to bring his mount to a halt. His arm straightened as he aimed a revolver at the men huddled behind the wall of bayonets. He roared once in anger, then began to fire. At such close range, the revolver was an effective weapon. The first bullet hit a Legionnaire just to Palmer's left in the very centre of his chest. The Frenchman crumpled, his cry of anguish lost in the noise of the fight. The second and third bullets both hit the man standing next to the one already shot. He fell backwards, his arms windmilling in the air as the heavy bullets cut him down. 2 men had been killed. A gap had been opened in the front of the square. The Austrian officer saw the opening his revolver had created. He spurred his horse hard, throwing the animal at the gap. His shout of victory was loud enough to be heard by every man in the ragged formation, the cry summoning more cavalrymen to the fight. Palmer saw the danger. He knew what would happen if the Austrian cavalry broke in. He stepped into the gap, hefting his rifle as he placed himself directly in the Austrian cavalry officer's path. "Fuck off!" He bellowed the curse as he swung his rifle. He made no attempt to hit the rider. Instead, he smashed the rifle's butt into the horse's mouth. The contact was brutal. The horse reared, its mouth gushing with blood, its terrified scream horribly loud. As its front legs lifted from the ground, the Legionnaire rammed his bayonet into the animal's chest, driving the steel deep. The officer was thrown, his body hitting the ground an instant before the wounded beast turned and galloped away. Palmer gave the Austrian no time to stand. He stepped forward and drove his bayonet into the man's heart, ramming it down hard before tearing the steel away. The Legionnaires cheered then. They roared their defiance, daring the Austrians to come against them. A few more had loaded their rifles. Now they fired, knocking men from their saddles or killing the horses that came close. The fire was ragged, but it was effective, and the Austrians nearest the square pulled away, looking for easier targets. "Where's Jack?" Fleming had to press his lips to Palmer's ear to make himself heard. "We need to find him." "No." Palmer was having none of it. "We can't just leave him." "Yes, we fucking can," Palmer shouted back. "I saw him go down. He's dead or dying. Either way, he's no use to us." Fleming shook his head. "I'm not leaving him." "Yes, you fucking are." Palmer growled the words, then slammed his rifle butt into the side of Fleming's head. He had held back some of his strength, but the blow was still powerful enough to knock the young man from his feet. He fell to the ground with all the grace of a sack of horse shit. Palmer turned on his heel, holding out his bayonet, wary of any Legionnaire who wanted to intervene. A few looked at him, but none stepped forward to come to Fleming's aid. Many had been present to hear Kearney make his promise that Fleming could leave once the battle was done. None would deny him that reward now. Seeing that no one would stop him, Palmer left Fleming on the ground. An Austrian cavalryman's horse was nearby, standing loyally by its master's corpse. Palmer walked towards it slowly, cooing at the animal, the soft sound soothing and calm. He stepped past the body, barely glancing at the ruined face that had taken a Minié bullet right through its centre. The horse's ears twitched and it shied away, but it was well trained and it stayed in place, waiting dutifully for its next command. Palmer took its reins easily enough, then led it back to where the square was slowly breaking up, the exhausted Legionnaires slumping to the ground, too tired to even start picking through the bodies of the enemy for their valuables. It took little time to haul Fleming's unconscious body across the saddle. Finally, Palmer had his man. Chapter 44. Jack scrabbled in the thin trickle of water that lay in the bottom of the ditch. Everything hurt, but he knew he could not give in. He found his footing, then pushed himself up, his muddied rifle in his hand. "Get up!" he shouted at Carney. The Legionnaire sergeant was on all fours, gasping for breath. "Get up, for God's sake!" There was no time to see if he would obey. The two Austrian cavalrymen were now hauling hard on their reins. In seconds they would be spurring back towards the ditch. Jack braced his legs. He had no idea how to fight two men on horseback whilst standing ankle-deep in mud. He and Carney would die like rats trapped in a bucket. He kept his eyes on the enemy horsemen even as he sensed the sergeant struggling to his feet. He could taste fear. It lingered on his tongue, bitter and acrid. Carney staggered upright, then pushed one leg forward so he could brace it on the front bank of the ditch. He raised his rifle, the butt pulled snugly into his shoulder. "You loaded?" He spoke out of the side of his mouth as he squinted down the barrel. "No." Jack spat out the word. "Then you really are a useless damn lobster." Carney's lip curled into a sneer, then stilled as he held his breath. The sharp retort of the rifle firing echoed around them. The Austrian cavalrymen were no more than 20 yards away. Carney's bullet hit the leading man in the face. Jack saw the spurt of blood erupt from the back of his head as it smashed through his skull. The Austrian's horse was at full speed when he was hit. It tripped, the sudden change of weight on its back throwing it out of stride, and hit the ground hard. The bones of both rider and horse snapped like twigs. The animal's sudden scream of terror cut off as the confused jumble of man and beast came to a shuddering halt 10 yards from the ditch. The second rider spurred hard, his pace unaltered by the death of his comrade. His sword lowered, the blade held steady even as his horse thundered towards the two stubborn legionnaires. "Come on!" Jack screamed his futile challenge. He would not go down without a fight. The Austrian cavalryman was charging towards him at full speed. The desire to run was overpowering. Fear surged through him, every fibre of his being trembled. But he planted his feet, bracing his rifle with the bayonet held out. He would not run. The distance closed with terrifying speed. There was no time to think. Jack sensed Carney at his side, the American presenting his own bayonet-tipped rifle outwards. They stood shoulder to shoulder, teeth bared in defiance, neither flinching from the inevitable collision. Then the Austrian swerved. It was well done. One moment the rider was thundering towards them, the next he kicked hard and twisted his mount to one side. He flashed past them, the horse stretching its legs as it leapt the ditch for a second time. "Shit!" Jack turned on the spot, his eyes fixed on the enemy cavalryman. "Come on, you bastard!" he hissed as he rammed his boot hard into the opposite side of the ditch, preparing to stand against the next charge. "For fuck's sake, turn around, you dolt!" He snapped the order at Carney, who was still facing the other way. The American did not move. "Carney!" Jack shouted angrily. He could not hope to stand alone. He tore his eyes away from the Austrian rider for long enough to berate the American for being so slow. "For God's sake!" The words died on his lips. Carney dropped his rifle, then fell to his knees, his hands clasped to his neck, fingers scrabbling over the huge gash that had been ripped in its side. The Austrian's sword had cut him without mercy, the blow coming in the span of a single heartbeat as the rider galloped past. For one dreadful second, Carney looked back at Jack, his eyes wide. Then he fell forward, turning so that he landed on his back. He lay in the dust, his body convulsing, hands clawing at the dreadful wound. Jack's soul froze, every emotion scoured from his being. Then he ran. His boots slipped as he scrambled free of the ditch, then he was up and running. Ahead of him, the Austrian cavalryman was still turning his mount around. The beast was tiring, and its rider had to work it hard to get it facing towards the lone soldier he had left in the ditch. Jack felt nothing as he ran. There was no fear, no rage or anger. He felt numb, empty, his soul barren. The Austrian saw him coming. He kicked his horse hard, forcing it back into motion. It lurched forward, its great muscles straining as it tried to increase speed. Jack just ran, legs pumping hard, mouth open in a silent war cry. The Austrian's horse was slow. It had been pushed past the point of exhaustion, and it was struggling. It had reached no more than a laboured trot when Jack attacked. He did not hesitate. He picked his spot even as he ran at full speed. When the horse came at him, he was ready. He dodged to one side, then rammed his bayonet forward with every last ounce of strength he possessed. It was a cruel blow, driven by grief, and it pierced the horse in the neck, the steel driven deep. Jack pushed his weight behind it, not caring that the bayonet would be stuck fast. The horse screamed. It was a dreadful, feral sound, the stricken beast driven mad by the sudden agony. It staggered on, its momentum driving it forward before it fell, blood pumping from the horrific gouge in its flesh. Its rider was thrown forward, all balance lost. Jack let his rifle go and threw himself at the Austrian. His hands clawed at the man's leg, blackened fingernails tearing at his breeches. The rider stood no chance. Jack tumbled him from the saddle and threw himself on top of him. He used his weight to pin him in place, hands locking tight around the Austrian's throat. He kept them there even as the man jackknifed underneath him, his body convulsing as he strained to get free. Jack leaned forward, fingers digging deep into the soft flesh of the man's throat. Still the Austrian struggled, even as Jack throttled the life out of him, his fists battering at Jack's head, every blow weaker than the one before. It took him a long time to die. "Connie?" Jack asked the question gently, as if waking the American from sleep. He squatted down, then reached forward, the touch of his blood-stained finger as gentle as he could make it. Connie's eyes popped open. "Take it easy." Jack breathed the words. He took hold of Connie's hands, which were locked tight around his neck. "Let me see." Slowly and carefully he eased the sergeant's hands to one side. The wound was oozing blood. Thick strands of gristle were clearly visible amidst the gore. The Austrian sword had cut deep. Connie sucked down a breath. The blood in the wound bubbled up, pink and frothy. Then he choked, more blood gurgling in his throat. Jack could find no words. He reached into Connie's jacket and pulled out a pale blue scarf he must have picked up in Genoa, his first thought to bandage the wound. But the American would not lie still. His hands scrabbled against Jack's, fighting his attempts to fix the scarf in place. It took several minutes before the grotesque gash was finally hidden from sight. "There you are. That should do." Jack spoke in little more than a whisper. He rocked back on his haunches, looking at the fresh blood streaked across his hands. He wanted to run, to flee from the horror of Connie's wound. Instead, he just sat there, powerless. He had never felt so impotent. Connie's right hand jerked across his chest, trying to get inside his blood-soaked jacket. It fumbled with the buttons, the fingers clumsy. "Rest easy." Jack reached forward to take hold of the sergeant's wrist. "I'll do it." He gently placed Connie's hand on his breast, then reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick wedge of what looked to be letters held together with string. "Give them." Blood rattled in Carney's throat, making the words barely audible, but Jack understood them well enough. He glanced at the uppermost letter. An address was written on the envelope in pencil. He did not bother to read it. Instead, he shoved the bundle into his own pocket, not caring that he left dark streaks of blood across it. "You can deliver them yourself." He offered the lie with a flicker of a smile. Carney tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Blood flecked his lips as he tried again. When they came, the words were so quiet that Jack could hardly hear them. "Kill me." For a moment, Jack could not breathe. Carney's eyes bored into him. The stare was fierce, and it was proud. "Kill me." The words were almost completely drowned by the constant flow of blood that filled Carney's throat. But Jack had understood them well enough. He knew what Carney wanted. He understood what was being asked. It was what he would want were the roles reversed. He had seen enough wounds to know which would kill. The American faced a long, agonizing, and drawn-out death. Carney gasped as he fought against the pain. He was shaking now, every muscle trembling. Somehow he managed to lift a hand. It clutched clumsily at Jack's, then pushed it lower so that it rested against the short sword at his waist. He shuddered and his grip tightened around Jack's wrist, the fingers digging in like claws before it fell away. Jack let his own hand stay on the hilt of the short sword. It was not a weapon made for fighting. The Legion's sergeants wore it as a badge of their rank, the tradition of more importance than the blade itself. But Jack knew that Carney would have kept the edge sharp. It would do the job well enough. It was easy to draw the blade. It fitted snugly into his hand. It did not weigh much, not like an officer's sword or a Maharaja's tulwar, but it would be enough to kill a man. He held it beside his thigh and out of Carney's sight. He understood what had to be done, but he still hesitated. He knew that killing the American would be a mercy. He had heard such pleas before, just as every survivor of battle had. Wounded men, crazed by suffering, would beg for a bullet to put an end to their misery. Often they were given it, their fellow soldiers willing to do that one last thing for their comrades in arms. Jack knew what had to be. It was a soldier's duty to a comrade. At the very last, a man had the right to die. Carney's eyes had closed. He was still alive, his chest rising and falling with every shallow gasp of breath. His face was screwed tight against the pain, and a thin trail of blood snaked from the corner of his mouth. For a moment, Jack hoped the American would just die. The notion tempted him. He could simply sit and wait for the inevitable. It would surely take a long time, but at least he would be spared from having to act, from having to be the one to end another life. Carney shuddered. He was suffering, every breath laboured, every second lived in agony. Jack sucked down a breath, then held it. He looked at Carney. The American's eyes flickered open and locked onto Jack's as he began to move the sword. They stayed there even as the blade pressed against his heart, the tip sliding through cloth and then into flesh. Then they closed for the last time, the window to his soul shut off for all eternity. Jack threw the sword away. He could feel the warmth of fresh blood on his hand. He did not have the will to wipe it away. Chapter 45. Palmer led the borrowed horse away from the fighting. The Austrian cavalry was still cutting down the stragglers, but the French retreat had been halted, the battered battalions in the brigade strong enough to ward off the enemy riders. No one paid him any attention. The wounded were streaming to the rear, absolved from the need to fight. They staggered, limped, and lurched towards some half-understood notion of safety, their bloody, torn bodies the defining emblem of courage. Many would not make it. They fell to the ground, ignored and forgotten, their battle and their lives ending on a churned-up field. Palmer walked past them all. He paid no heed to the entreaties for aid. He had no water left to share, and his well of compassion had run dry. He thought only of his duty and of delivering Fleming to Ballard. As he walked, he looked at the man draped across the saddle. For a moment he worried that he had hit Fleming too hard, a thin trickle of blood running down from the man's temple. Then Fleming stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a half-second as he drifted in and out of consciousness before closing again. It was reassuring. It meant he would live. Palmer found it hard to understand why Ballard had declared Fleming's life to be worth so much more than Jack's. He had felt a moment's sorrow when he saw Jack go down, the death of the younger man reaching a place inside him that he had ignored for so long that he had believed it to be gone forever. He'd enjoyed working with a partner, even one as cocksure and strong-willed as Jack had been. Such thoughts were interrupted as he heard shouting coming from behind him. At first he paid them no attention. Then the shouts and the screams intensified, and he found the energy to glance over his shoulder. The remains of the Austrian cavalry had turned from the squares that the other French battalions had formed. Their horses were tired and their arms were bloody to the shoulder, but still they had the desire to kill. They left the hastily formed squares behind and turned their attention to the last men still in the open. Palmer had turned in time to see the cavalrymen cut into the wounded stragglers behind him. The enemy regiments no longer rode stirrup to stirrup, their formed ranks long since disrupted by the fighting, but they still hit the fugitives in style, the defenceless men dying in droves. The scream stopped almost immediately. Those still strong enough to run did so in silence, the time for cries of terror now long past. Those without that strength died where they were, their final moments spent in soundless horror. Palmer looked at the battered rifle he still carried. Its bayonet was bloodied to the hilt, and the tip had been bent out of shape. Both the barrel and the stock were pitted and scarred, and the butt was caked in blood. He had not bothered to reload, the thought that he should have done so a fleeting regret. It did not take him long to tie the reins across the saddle, the temporary lashing the best he could hope to do in the time left to him. Then he slapped the horse hard across the flank, goading the tired animal into motion. It lurched away at little more than a half-assed trot, Fleming's body bouncing in the saddle. Palmer sighed as he turned to fight one final time. The Austrian riders were close now. The enemy's horses were on their last legs, but he did not doubt they would come for him. There would be no reprieve, no miraculous escape like at the end of a great fable. He knew what fate had planned for him. He planted his feet and hefted his rifle in both hands. At least he would go down fighting. He felt a few heavy raindrops land on his head. The rain that had threatened to fall all day was finally making a belated appearance. It heralded the arrival of a storm that would likely put an end to the fighting, but it would come too late for him. An Austrian cavalryman spurred towards him. Palmer saw that the man had lost his shako, so now rode with his hair ruffled by the wind. He tensed, thinking to repeat the blow to the horse's mouth that had served him well so many times before. But he was tired, and he was slow. The Austrian rider gave his mount the spur, urging the beast to a final burst of speed. Palmer saw the change in the horse's motion. He started to swing the butt of his rifle, trying to time the blow so that it would land square and true. He was too late. The Austrian rider was already on him. The man's sword tore into his chest, the notched blade gouging a deep crevice across his front before the horse's momentum ripped the blade free. Palmer fell to his knees, his rifle dropping from his hands. There was time to look down, to see the rush of blood that smothered him from nipple to navel, before he crumpled over. The storm that had threatened all day burst across the battlefield with biblical ferocity. Day turned to night as thick grey-black clouds smothered the sun. The rain came down in a torrent, any notion of carrying on the fight washed away by the downpour that soaked the combatants to the skin in minutes. With the rain came great gusts of wind. Whirlwinds of yellow dust billowed across the plain like powder smoke, reducing the visibility to mere yards. The few trees were battered, branches torn from their trunks like arms and legs ripped from bodies by fast-moving roundshot. Jack looked up and let the rain wash across his face. It felt cold as it drummed onto his skin, but the sensation revived him. He did not know how long he had sat on the ground next to Carney. He barely felt the cramp in his legs or the pain in his back. His mind had been emptied of all thought. His soul was as numb as his flesh. A great bolt of lightning seared across the heavens. It was followed by a peal of thunder that would have overwhelmed the heaviest artillery barrage. The sound resonated through him, lighting the spark of life that had been nearly extinguished in the fighting. It was time to move. Gingerly he eased himself to his feet, slinging his rifle onto his shoulder. His back ached abominably, the pain searing up and down his body to leave his legs trembling. The wounds he had taken in the fight made themselves known, the aches and bruises interspersed with brighter flashes of pain caused by Austrian bayonets. He stood in the rain, letting the storm wash over him until the first chill came, the single shiver that ran through his abused flesh a delicious torture that reminded him he was still alive. He could not bear to look at Carney's corpse. He went north, walking through a field of flattened rye. The local population would likely go hungry that winter. Hundreds of acres of grain had been destroyed by the battle that had been fought on a front many miles wide. Yet there was a new crop that now smothered the ground, one that would improve the soil for generations. He steered clear of any formed bodies of French infantry that he saw. He supposed the French would claim victory, their occupation of the battlefield all the proof their eager generals would need to proclaim their success. For his part, he did not care who had won or who had lost. He was indifferent as to how the French would write of their great success, or the strategy and manoeuvres they would claim had earned it for them. His part in the struggle meant nothing. His was no tale of a valiant hero, a fable where one man decided the fate of a battle. His was a tale of horror unleashed, where men died screaming and friends begged for death. He walked through a field of corpses. Many wore the same blue uniform he had borrowed, the colour now turned almost to black by the rain. The men from the Legion lay in every direction. Some alone, others in small groups, cut down by the Austrian cavalry in the same desperate flight that had seen Jack and Carney left cowering in a muddy ditch. A few bodies moved. Hands lifted towards him as he approached, voices begging for aid, for water, or simply for a bullet to put an end to their suffering. He ignored them all. There might be a time to try to help, but it had not yet arrived. He still had a mission, a purpose that he clung to lest his soul be suffocated by the suffering that surrounded him. He picked his way past the heaps of the dead and the dying. His boots caught against discarded equipment, the field littered with knapsacks, mess tins, shakos, kepis, belts, blood-stained clothing, broken weapons, and abandoned rifles. The rain fell constantly, driven by the wind so that at times it was almost horizontal. All the while, great flashes of lightning were interspersed with the deep booms and crashes of thunder. It was as if the gods had been angered by the battle, and now raged in the heavens, their display a vivid demonstration of their superiority over the struggles of man. Jack did not know where to search first, so he retraced the path of the Legion's retreat as best he could, towards the scene of the hand-to-hand fight with the Hungarians. The enemy were close by, but the rain shrouded him, hiding him from view. He trod carefully amongst the bodies, always looking down as he searched the grey, lifeless faces of the dead. He did not find either of the men he was looking for. He closed his eyes, picturing the flight from the Hungarians. He remembered seeing a group that had stood together, a square that he had glimpsed forming amidst the chaos. Angling northwards, he found the place easily enough. Half a dozen dead enemy horses, confirmation that at least some of the Legionnaires had managed to hold their ground. There were a few French bodies, but here the wounded had gone, a sign that the men had been able to retreat in good order, taking their comrades with them. None of the dead Legionnaires were familiar to him. He stood amidst the corpses and thought about lying down. It would be a sweet relief to let it all end, to close his eyes and allow oblivion to claim him. The temptation was strong, but he knew he would not give in to it, for the mission was not yet done. No matter what, he had to know what had happened to his comrades. Chapter 46. Ballard stood outside the aid station, staring into space. The rain was lashing down, the drops jumping a good 2 feet back into the air as they hit the ground with all the force of a canister shell. It drummed off his head and shoulders. His hair slicked to his scalp and his dark blue jacket doubled in weight as it absorbed the deluge. Yet standing here was a relief after enduring the cloying atmosphere inside the aid station for so long. The rain felt wonderfully clean, and he prayed that it would scour the stains from his soul as effectively as it was cleaning the blood and the sweat from his skin. "Mr. Ballard! Mr. Ballard, help me over here!" Ballard turned on command. A fresh wagon had pulled up outside the aid post. He could no longer tally how many had come in. 100? 2? Whey-coloured faces lifted in hope as they reached their destination, the wounded men looking down with wild eyes as a single orderly walked towards them with Mary at his side. It had been Mary who had summoned him. The apron she had borrowed was covered with gore, as were her bare arms, the streaks of blood smearing in the rain. She paid the storm no heed and trudged through the puddles with determination, her eyes fixed on the men waiting for her aid. Ballard watched her as she walked. Her dress had quickly become soaked and now clung to her body, and her hair was flattened against her head. She was covered in filth, and her face was puffy and haggard after so many hours doing all she could for the wounded. Yet to Ballard's eyes, she had never looked as beautiful. He found he did not regret making his offer. He had considered the idea of marrying again before, but he had always been so busy. Suggestions had been made. Once or twice a year he would receive a letter from a distant family member or an associate, which would gently mention some worthy woman in search of a husband. He had never paid them much heed, the itch for a wife one that he never seemed to have the time to scratch, until he had met Mary. "Mr. Ballard! Mr. Ballard!" Another voice called for his attention, one that scattered his foolish musings to the wind. He was moving towards it before any thought to do so fully formed in his mind. He walked fast, lifting a hand to shelter his eyes from the rain. His heart raced, the voice bringing hope that it heralded the arrival of the man he had come so far to find. His hope died. There were no horses. There were no strong men bringing in their quarry. Just a sorry-looking boy walking alone through the rain. "William!" Ballard called out, shouting to be heard over the deluge. The boy came to stand in front of him. Ballard took him by the shoulders, holding the exhausted lad upright. "Where are they?" "I don't know." The reply came back as little more than a sob. "The horses? Did they take the horses?" Billy bit his lip, then shook his head, the motion flinging water to either side. Ballard saw the bruises on the boy's face. The flesh around his ear and across his cheek blackened and blotchy. The lad had taken a beating. "Did you see them? Did you see them at all?" Ballard shook him as he fired the questions. "No." He let go of the boy then. The hopelessness of his situation was nearly more than he could bear. Exhaustion engulfed him and left his legs shaking with the effort of keeping himself upright. He gazed past the boy, no longer able to look at the bearer of such bad tidings. Another wagon was making its way along the track that led towards the aid station, another cargo of ruined bodies about to vie for the scant attention that the handful of orderlies and surgeons could provide. "Billy!" Ballard did not turn to look at Mary as she spotted her child. The joy in her tone hurt him, her love displayed even amidst the foulness of a battlefield. He heard their voices, but could not bear to listen to their exchange. Jealousy ran through him with enough force to leave him shaking. With a sigh, he approached the wagon that had just arrived. Like all the others, it was badly overloaded. The men who could still do so slipped over the sides, leaving behind only those unable to move. Ballard saw the uniforms for the first time. The trousers were white, and their dark blue jackets had green epaulets. It was the same uniform he had given to the two men charged with finding his target. The familiar sight brought him up short, a last flare of hope surging deep in his belly. It pushed away the exhaustion, his body responding to the warm rush the emotion created. Quick, urgent steps took him into the crowd of men that milled around the rear of the wagon. He moved through them, searching faces, looking for the flicker of familiarity that he longed for. It did not take him long. He reached the wagon and pulled himself up. 4 men were stretched out on the floor. 2 were dead, their faces waxy and grey. One of those still alive had lost the right-hand side of his chest. The dreadful wound had been stuffed full of lint, then bound with what looked like part of a bedsheet. The hole was smothered with blackened blood that glistened and pulsated in the rain. The last man's wounds were hidden from view, but Ballard could hear his soft moans and sobs even over the noise of the rain. None of the 4 was the man he sought. He turned, hopelessness fighting for control of his soul. Another wagon was pulling up behind the one he was on. It too was full of men from the Legion. He jumped down. The ground was slick, the wheels of the wagons churning it to so much slurry, but still he moved quickly, sending up fountains of water with every urgent pace. Once again the lightly wounded disembarked first. The men ambled away, moving slowly, their expressions revealing the strain of their journey. He pushed through them, pausing to look at every face. None bore the resemblance that he wanted so desperately to see. He looked hopefully down the road, searching for another wagon-load of wounded legionnaires. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the road was empty. The temptation to end his search was strong, but he hauled himself up onto the second wagon nonetheless. He would see it through to the bitter end. There were only 2 men left on the wagon bed. Both appeared to be alive. One had been hit in the guts, his uniform ripped open, revealing the grey-blue mess of his belly. His hands clasped around his innards, holding them in place with trembling fingers that were covered to the wrists with gore. Ballard checked the man's face. A fleeting moment of joy that it was not his target replaced swiftly by disappointment that the search was not over. The second man lay on his side, his face pressed against the wooden floor of the wagon. Ballard squatted, then picked his way forward, trying not to jar either man with his mud-splattered boots. He no longer noticed the thin river of blood that ran freely across the wagon bed. The rain had darkened the man's blonde hair. It lay tousled against his scalp, with thick strands glued to his forehead. His eyes were shut, yet the pattern of his features was easily recognizable. Ballard could barely breathe. He stayed where he was, staring at the face he had not seen for so long, unable to believe that the moment had finally arrived. He reached out, a single finger moving to ease the hair out of the man's eyes. The touch sent a jolt running through him. It was enough to make him gasp, and he had to take hold of the wagon's side lest he fall. The man's eyes flickered open. For a moment they looked up, unseeing. Then they focused. He gazed up at Ballard, dazed and unsure. "Father? My boy." Ballard choked on the words. His hand lowered for a second time to push the hair out of his son's face. "Father?" Fleming's voice wavered with disbelief. "Hush." Ballard smiled. "Rest there." He straightened up. He no longer noticed the rain or the cold. He no longer smelled the acrid stink of powder smoke amidst the stench of old blood and torn bowels. He had found his son, and nothing else mattered. "We are leaving. Immediately." Ballard had steered Mary out of the dressing station. He held her under a tree, sheltering her from the worst of the storm. "Now?" Mary wiped a hand across her face. It left a trail of watery blood. "Yes, now. I have him." Ballard could not hide his delight. "What the devil do you mean?" Mary was exhausted and struggling to comprehend. "I found him." Ballard took hold of her elbow and turned her to face the other direction. A short distance away, a man was squatting on his haunches beside a bucket. The water it contained was the colour of blood, but he was still using it to wash his face as best he could. Sensing Mary's scrutiny, he got slowly to his feet and walked towards her. "That's him." Mary finally understood Ballard's reaction. "That's the man you've had everyone looking for." "Yes." Ballard kept a firm grip on her elbow. "He is my son." "Your what?" Mary shook off the guiding hand. "We came here for your son." "I will explain, I promise. Now is not the time." He spoke urgently. He lifted an arm as he ushered the man into the conversation. "Mary, may I present William Ballard, my son?" "No. That's not my name, not any more." The blonde-haired Legionnaire spoke quietly but firmly. "Fleming. That's my name now." Mary barely looked at him. She turned the force of her gaze on Ballard. "Where's Jack?" He fell. Fleming spoke first. His words were soft, as if he were embarrassed. "Palmer told me." Mary's eyes narrowed at the news. She did not gasp or appear shocked. "And where is Palmer?" "He must be dead. He hit me, knocked me senseless." Fleming looked at Mary, his eyes full of pain. "If he was alive, he wouldn't have left me." "And here you are." Mary made the statement sound like an accusation. I'm not staying. Yes, you damn well are. Ballard had watched the conversation like a hawk. Now he interjected. Damn your eyes, do not dare to tell me what to do. Fleming snapped at his father, then winced, the force of his words clearly hurting him. A single drop of blood trickled from his forehead to run down his cheek like a red tear. You are my son. Not any more. I even chose to use Mother's maiden name. He glared at Ballard. Enough! The Major snapped the single word. Men died to bring you to me. Do not make that all have happened for nothing. I did not ask you to come here. Fleming raised a hand, then clutched at his head, swaying on his feet. The blood was running quicker now, the single drop followed by a flood. He closed his eyes against the pain, but his body betrayed him and his legs gave out. He crumpled and fell into his father's arms. Ballard staggered as he took his son's full weight. For a moment he held him close, then he looked beseechingly at Mary. Mary, help me. Mary made no move to obey. She stared at Ballard as if seeing him for the first time. Help me! Ballard gasped as he struggled to hold Fleming in his arms. He is my son. The simple words meant everything, and Mary understood. She glanced over her shoulder. Her own son was sitting on a stool, staring into space, as if looking at an object far away in the distance. The sight shamed her. She stepped forward, bracing her arm across Fleming's chest. With her help, Ballard lowered the bloodied Legionnaire to the ground. We are leaving, right here and now. She took control swiftly. She had watched Ballard's merry little gang for weeks now. She had not interfered with their plans, such as they had been, leaving them to their mission. The time for sitting on the sidelines had passed. You will do everything I say. Do you understand? She spoke slowly, as if to a difficult child. Ballard swallowed, then nodded. We will take one of these carts, one of the small ones. We will go to the rail line and get on a train, and we won't stop until we're back in London. When we are there, and only then, I will accept your offer. Is that clear? Yes, Ballard replied in an instant. There was no need to say anything more. Mary pulled a bandage out of her apron pocket. It was blood-stained and smeared with dirt, but it would suffice for the moment. With deft movements she bandaged Fleming's head. Then she stood, wiping her hands on her blood-crusted apron. For a moment she felt a pang of grief for Jack. It did not last. She could not mourn his loss. Once he had meant something to her, but that had departed with the last flushes of her youth. Her son was all that mattered now. Everything she did from that moment forth would be for his benefit. She looked at Ballard. The Major was staring at his own son, his eyes roving over the young man's face as if trying to commit every pore to memory. She knew he would give her the security that she needed, the home and the future that Billy deserved. Becoming Ballard's wife would be the best bargain of her life. Chapter 47. Jack struggled to place one foot in front of the other. The rain came down in torrents, unceasing and uncaring. Few men were foolish enough to still be walking the battlefield. Most had found their mates and had hunkered down, sitting in misery as they waited for dawn. The rain made every step a test of endurance, yet the downpour also spared him. In the murk he could no longer see the ruined bodies that lay in every direction. With the rain pounding against his head, he could not hear the pitiful cries of the wounded left to suffer where they had fallen. He found the copse where they had left Billy. There were troops among the trees, tired men who had sought what little shelter they could find. Jack did not know what regiment they belonged to, or even what army, but one thing was certain. There was no sign of Billy or the horses. He looked around him. He saw nothing but rain. The last of the day's light was fading fast, the leaden skies cutting off any hint of evening sun. He shivered as he stood there. The chill was deep in his bones. He was tired, so very tired. But he could not rest. Not yet. He turned his back on the copse and walked into the teeth of the gale, bending over like a redcoat advancing in the face of enemy guns. It was hard to keep moving. The rain had soaked his uniform and he shivered with every step. He found the road that led along the bottom of the ridge easily enough. In the darkness it was harder to see the corpses that lay on either side, and he stumbled as his tired legs caught against the dead flesh of men dragged off the road's surface. The going was easier once he was on the road, but the storm did not let up. Above his head the skies raged with thunder and lightning, the display so ferocious that he could not help flinching every few paces. He was nearly upon the aid station before he saw it. A few lanterns had been lit to give the place an unearthly glow. He saw shadowy figures moving around, a handful of men and women tending to the wounded through the long, lonely hours of the night that would see many of their charges breathe their last. He walked to the far side of the buildings. He tried not to look at the great heap of bodies at the roadside, or at the smaller pile of severed limbs beside it. He turned a deaf ear to the screams and cries that echoed from within the aid station, the pitiful wails coming one after another without pause. He spotted the place where he had bade farewell to Ballard and Mary, and walked towards it, his pace increasing. He felt a pathetic spurt of something that came close to excitement as he peered through the gloom, searching the ground for the fire that he knew Mary would have kept alive even in the storm. He looked for Ballard's distinctive figure and for Billy's smaller frame. He slowed down, scanning in every direction, certain that they would be there. He tensed, waiting for the shout of recognition. Ballard would be sure to admonish him, but he did not care. He wanted to be back in the fold, to return to people who knew him. He wanted to be home. The excitement faded. He saw no one. His pace slowed until he was standing by the tree. The rain fell without pause, but he no longer felt it. His tired mind tried to think clearly, to consider where they might have gone. It failed, and a feeling of such loneliness overwhelmed him that it was all he could do to hold back a cry of anguish. He did not know how long he stood there. Everything he had done these past weeks had been at the behest of Ballard. The search for Fleming had been all. It had given him purpose when he had none. Without it, he had nothing. Without his friends, he had no one. "Monsieur?" Jack started at the sound of the unfamiliar voice. Who are you?" His voice cracked. He sounded like an old man. "Ah, you are English too." A thin French orderly was looking at him with concern. "Are you wounded?" No." Jack fought through the fog in his mind. "Were there other Englishmen here? A woman, a boy?" "Oui, monsieur. An English gentleman and a lady they helped with the wounded." "Where are they now?" "They left." The orderly shrugged. "A few hours ago, I would say. They took a carriage. They had a boy with them and a wounded man. A Legionnaire, if I'm not mistaken." "How—" Jack's voice caught in his throat as he tried to speak. He sucked down a draught of air, then spat, clearing the sourness from his gullet. "How did the Legionnaire get here?" "He must have come in on a wagon of wounded." The orderly pulled a face at the odd question. "There are so many wounded, monsieur." "Yes." Jack was grateful for the information. The Legionnaire had to be Fleming. Somehow everything had turned out to Ballard's satisfaction. He sensed Palmer's hand in the matter, but the orderly had made no mention of the large Englishman. "I must leave you," the orderly interrupted his thoughts. "There is much to be done here." Jack nodded. Ballard and the others were lost to him, but Palmer was still out there somewhere in the darkness. The knowledge ignited a small flame of hope deep inside him. He would try to find him in the morning. For the moment, he had discovered enough. Jack awoke to sunshine. The warmth of the morning sun wandered across his face, its touch like a lover's the morning after a night spent in each other's arms. He savoured the feel of it, lifting his face with his eyes clamped shut. He did not want to open them. He did not want to see what waited for him. The sun passed behind a cloud, shutting off the warmth. He sighed, then opened his eyes. It was time to face another day. Slowly and painfully, he levered himself to his feet. He was chilled to the bone and his uniform was damp, streaked with mud and stained with old blood. His whole body ached and he gasped as he stood, his head swimming. He reached out to grasp at a tree, holding himself upright. He was also hungry. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning, and now his stomach growled painfully. Yet he had no food with him, and so the hunger, like the pain, would have to be ignored. He looked down at the muddy hollow next to the thin line of cypress trees that had been his bed for the night. An inch or two of water lay in the depression his body had made in the sodden soil. It had not been a comfortable place to rest, but still he had slept, the exhaustion claiming him despite the discomfort. Somewhere in the distance a bugle sounded, summoning the battered and exhausted troops who had camped on the field of battle. It was the first sign of a return to normality, the clear notes a reminder that the men who had slept on the sodden ground were soldiers, not vagrants. The battlefield was shrouded in mist, but he could just make out several parties of men beginning the harrowing task of sifting through the dead. They would be searching for the fallen from their own regiments, so that their comrades could at least be given some sort of burial. It would be the last thing their army could do for them. They were not the only ones searching. He could see several small groups of civilians, the peasants of Lombardy arriving to pick over the dead and the dying, their possessions enough of allure to bring even the most timid souls in search of bounty. He did not begrudge their presence. The dead no longer had need for such things. The bugle sounded again, the notes muffled by the heavy air. It was time for him to move, but still he lingered, trying to order his thoughts. The French orderly at the aid station had not mentioned Palmer's presence with the others. That meant he was either dead or missing. If he were missing, then Jack was certain Ballard was ruthless enough to leave his bodyguard behind. But it was hard to think of Palmer allowing himself to be lost. Jack sighed. He could think of only one reason why Palmer would have left Fleming's side. He looked again at the groups picking through the dead. There was only one way to find out for sure if Palmer had fallen. If he were dead, then he had to be found. He retrieved his rifle from the muddy ground, then trudged away from the line of trees. He had a vague notion of which direction to take, the landscape he was now passing familiar. He walked into a vision of hell. Bodies lay in every direction. Some were in heaps, 3, 4 or more corpses intertwined, limbs contorted at impossible angles, open eyes bulging and staring. Many were missing limbs or even whole sections of flesh, their cause of death obvious. Others lay as if asleep, peaceful at the last. The fields on which they sprawled had been devastated. Acres of wheat and corn had been flattened. Orchards that had been carefully tended for generations now lay in ruins, the trees mangled and shattered. Great holes had been gouged in the soil, the earth ripped and torn apart by hundreds of rounds of shot and shell. They were now filled with pools of bloody water, or worse. The ground was littered with the detritus of battle. An army's worth of discarded equipment lay in every direction, some as broken as the bodies that had carried it, some simply dropped as the battle ebbed and flowed. He walked through it all until he found the ground where the Legion had fought the Hungarians. He had searched that area the night before, so now he turned towards the west, thinking to follow the path some of the Legionnaires must have taken as they ran from the Austrian cavalry. The mist was thinning. He felt the warmth of the sun on his back as he walked. As the haze lifted, so the full horror of the battlefield was revealed. The sight of the dead was enough to sour a man's soul for eternity. But worse still was the wounded. The men who had survived the night and now faced the dawn with hope of salvation. Most lay still, but he felt their eyes following him. A man wearing the uniform of the Zouave stared at him as he approached. He looked like a living ghost, his skin the colour of ash. As Jack came closer, he shook with agitation, and his lips moved in a silent plea for help. Jack ignored him with difficulty. He walked to the nearest body, a man who had been hit in the neck by a shell splinter that had half severed his head from his body. The ground around him was black with old blood. He peered down at the face. It was not Palmer. He moved on to the next. It lay on its front, arms and legs spread wide. Carefully he wedged his boot under a shoulder, then lifted the torso so he could see its face. Sightless blue eyes stared back at him over a fabulous black moustache. It was not the man he sought. He straightened up, massaging the kinks out of his spine. He tried not to count the bodies. He moved on to the next, and then the next. Some were already blackening, the flesh swollen and hideous. Flies had laid claim to many, and he was forced to flap his hands over ruined faces as he checked each one for the familiar features of the man he had begun to think of as a friend. God save us. He could not help hissing the words. He had come to stand over the body of a boy. The lad's drum lay a few feet away, the side smashed and broken and the skin peeled back like a torn blister. He had been killed by a sword stroke that had cut through his skull, so that it was opened from crown to chin. Jack turned away, sickened to the core. It was only then that he spotted a familiar shape lying on the ground a dozen yards away from the dead boy. It did not take him long to reach it. The man was larger than most of the bodies left lying in the bright morning sun. He wore the uniform of the Legion, but it was stretched tight across his back, the jacket not well fitted to his large frame. Jack did not need to turn the body over to know who lay face down in the muddy grave. He had found Palmer. It was the final proof he had sought. The last of Ballard's party had been accounted for, and it confirmed that Jack was once again quite alone. Epilogue. Jack handed over the last cigar in the box. Danke. The Austrian Jaeger breathed his thanks as he sank back onto the ground. He lay rolling the cigar under his nose, his eyes closing in silent ecstasy as he smelled something other than the stench of his own corrupt flesh. Jack did not wait for anything more. As ever, he felt wholly inadequate when confronted by the men living with their broken bodies. The cigars had been a good idea. He had bought up all he could find, then handed them out to any man who wanted them. It was a small gesture, but he did not know what else to do. The people of Medolay were doing their best. The Lombard villagers had opened their houses. taking in the wounded horde that had descended upon them, the men from both sides given the same care. There were still too many to be housed, and so dozens lay under hastily erected awnings. Even the village church was full, every last inch of space now a resting place for a wounded man from the 3 armies that had fought just 2 days previously. Jack tossed the empty cigar box onto a grass verge, then went to find more water. The wounded men had an unquenchable thirst. They begged for water constantly, and he had spent much of the night going from man to man with whatever cruddy liquid he could find. "Putain! Do not throw that away!" Jack glanced up sharply, and found himself looking at a man wearing a formal business suit that had seen better days. The man was dark-haired, with a fine set of mutton chops. He looked haggard as if he hadn't slept for a week. At that particular moment, he was glaring directly at Jack, his expression stern and disapproving. "Do you have nothing better to do, Englishman?" He walked across and picked up the discarded packaging before thrusting it back into Jack's grip. "It's a useful thing. It can be used to carry dressings. Leave it near the supply wagon by the church." Jack took the admonishment with good grace. "Who are you?" "My name is Dunant." "You're French?" Jack tried to place the man's odd accent. "No, Swiss." Dunant considered Jack for a moment. "I heard a foreigner was here. The cigars, they were a good idea, a kindness." Jack offered a thin smile at the praise. "I didn't know what else to do." No one does." Dunant plucked at Jack's elbow, then steered him to his side as he began to walk. "There is no organization. The men who planned this battle thought nothing of this, of what would happen to the men whose lives they ruined." He shook his head sadly. "They prepare for battle. They manufacture cannon and rifles, their minds focused on how to kill better, how to break more men's bodies. They do not think what to do with those bodies. If they put half as much effort into that, then think what they could achieve." He looked at Jack, his eyes glittering with barely contained passion. "Think what just 100 trained nurses could do. We are overwhelmed." The Swiss businessman led Jack across the road, darting through the procession of wagons that crawled along at barely walking pace. Jack had learned that they were heading to a hospital in Castiglione, although he had no idea how any place, no matter how organized, could hope to cope with the vast numbers of wounded being sent there. Officers, cavalrymen, and infantrymen of both sides were lumped in together. All were bleeding, torn, and exhausted, and all were still covered with the dust and grime of the battlefield. "Someone must do something!" Dunant spoke fiercely as they approached the church. "This cannot be allowed to happen again. If the fools want to fight, they must be prepared to prevent such suffering as this." They paused as an orderly dragged a corpse across their path, its head bumping sickeningly against the ground as he hauled it along by the ankles. "Come." Dunant pulled at Jack's elbow, and they followed the orderly, who had disappeared around the side of the church. Jack went reluctantly. He did not know why he had been selected for this lecture. He supposed Dunant needed someone to talk to vent his anger and frustration. He did not blame him. He himself had fought in many battles, but he had never been forced to stick around to witness the suffering that followed. "There." Dunant stopped as they too turned the corner of the church. "Now you will understand." Jack swallowed the bile that surged into his throat. He was staring at a pile of bodies. It was like nothing he'd ever seen. Hundreds of corpses, perhaps thousands, lay in a jumbled heap. At first it was hard to pick out the human forms amidst the twisted wreckage of so many lives. Then it all became horribly clear. We don't know how many we have put there. Dunant was moved to tears. He turned to Jack, holding him firmly on each forearm. We cannot let this happen again. Jack stared past Dunant's shoulder. He could not tear his eyes away from the mountain of the dead. He shuddered. He knew he was looking at his future, at the fate that waited for him. One day his own body would lie in the midst of such a heap. It would be his bulging, staring eyes that would confront an appalled witness, his limbs twisted at impossible angles, his flesh distorted, swollen, and black. The noise of a commotion came from within the church. Dunant dropped Jack's arms before bustling away. Jack followed, eager to leave the sight of the dead behind him. The inside of the church was wonderfully cool. Dunant's boots echoed loudly on the flagstones as he marched towards the source of the argument they had heard from outside. A French zouave was on his feet, his fists raised as he bellowed at 4 wounded Austrian soldiers lying on stretchers. He was being restrained by the slight figure of a French orderly who had placed himself between the enraged man and the target of his abuse. Dunant strode into the melee without hesitation. He was a head shorter than the zouave, but he got straight into the Frenchman's face, calming him down before leading him back to his own place amidst some wounded comrades, the church once again falling into a respectful silence. The Swiss walked back to Jack, shaking his head slowly from side to side. As he came closer, Jack saw the grey pallor of his skin and the dark, puffy circles around his eyes. Dunant was clearly exhausted. Such foolishness. He spoke softly as he approached. That man, he thought those poor souls were Hungarians. Many of the French loathed them. Something about the killing of the wounded. Whatever it is, it was enough to send him into a rage. He was still shaking his head. How can man possess such hatred for his fellow man? Jack did not know how to answer. He knew hatred. He knew what it was to want to kill, to need to kill. The notion shamed him. Come. Dunant was watching Jack closely. He must have sensed something of the turmoil going on inside the Englishman's mind, as he was looking at him with concern. He took Jack by the arm to steer him back to the door. It was a relief to be led back into the morning sunshine. Dunant let go of Jack's arm. Thank you. Jack pulled a face. You have nothing to thank me for. Dunant shrugged. You are here. You are helping. I do not think you will get any thanks for doing so. I'm not doing it for thanks. No. Dunant searched Jack's face with his eyes. You seem lost. I am, Jack replied with bitter honesty. He did not know what he was doing there, but he had nowhere else to go. He had once thought of returning to London, of searching for a man called Shaw. Revenge was long overdue, yet somehow the idea of another death now seemed tawdry. It meant nothing. He thought, too, of Mary, and of going to find her to make sure she was well settled. He also thought of Ballard, and of finally discovering what had driven the intelligence officer to come so far to find the man he had known as Fleming. Ballard still held the key to Jack's name and to his funds. A wise man would make sure that both were secured now that the mission was completed. But Jack was not wise, and he found that none of these things mattered. Nothing did. You should go home. Dunant had said nothing as he watched the struggle on Jack's face. Jack snorted. Home. The word mocked him. I have no home. Then I pity you. Dunant reached out and patted his shoulder. There must be somewhere you can go. No, there is nowhere. Dunant smiled. Then you must do something. But make sure it is something useful. And no more littering. His face creased into a smile. I'm not going anywhere. Come and find me later. If you would like to help, I'm sure there are good things you can do here. He turned away, leaving Jack standing outside the church. Jack sucked down a deep breath, then reached inside his jacket. He pulled out a wedge of letters held together with string. There was an address written on the face of the uppermost letter, the thin strokes of a pencil just about legible beneath black streaks of old blood. He picked at the muck with a fingernail. He thought about Dunant's words. Carney had handed him the letters. They had been the last thing he had thought of before he died. That made them important. Jack peered at the address. It was a long way away, and it would be one hell of a journey to get there. But he had nothing else planned. He would do as Dunant suggested. He would do a useful thing. He would deliver Carney's letters.